and today we're going to talk a bit about these eternal beings, the gods of Egypt. At the beginning of almost every one of my lectures, I ask people to see with eyes of believers. And that's no different today, but today I also ask you to consider with hearts that are critical. Think about how these things that we're going to talk about tonight are related to your particular religious background. Whether you're a believer or not, we all hold elements of our childhood faiths in our hearts forever. They're inescapable. What I hope that you'll see tonight are the connections, these threads that bind all of us through faith. And when you have that moment, I wouldn't mind if you put your hand up or let me know in some respect, because there is some wonderful moments here that are aha moments, and I'd love to know what those are for you tonight. Ancient Egypt, as almost every great culture, was polytheistic. There were more than 2,000 to 4,000 gods, including demons. And these gods were neither all-powerful nor all-knowing, and they weren't omnibenevolent by any respect. The gods were powerful, but were generally immortal and omnipresent in all places and at all times. They could affect people in visible and in invisible ways. The purposes, the meanings, and the powers that these gods held often varied from time to time, from year to year, and region to region. The gods were ordered in a hierarchy. There were top gods and there were gods who did menial tasks. The most important gods began as local deities and attracted more followers as the influence of their hometowns rose. You might consider this in the same way as a small town maybe having a sports team, and then as that small town grows and grows and grows and becomes a large metropolitan, that sports team becomes very popular and well followed as well. It's the same concept that as more and more people come to these territories and become believers, the gods grow in their ability to accommodate the needs of these people. When a new territory was conquered, its local gods were often assimilated into the Egyptian cosmology of gods. The Romans learned this well. In a brilliant move, the Egyptians showed governments how to incorporate new peoples into their state by allowing them to continue to worship their gods and to continue to believe in their faith. All that they said is, this is one more that we add. It was no problem. We already have 2,000 or 3,000. What's one or two more? And for those people who did believe, they were being conquered by people who understood them, who allowed them to continue their life without changing their ways. The Egyptians believed that gods controlled every aspect of their lives, and temples were built all over to honor them. Gods were not all good. In fact, many gods were far from good. Gods were often pictured holding the ankh, life, and a staff, which implied power. In some periods, Egyptians even believed that gods could die and be reborn, and there are even places with cemeteries for gods. Benevolent but unreliable were the gods. Prayers often went unanswered, as they do even today. Believers offered sacrifices and worshipped at their temples to win the attention and the favor of these gods. The characters of gods were not neatly defined. Some gods were associated, like the sun god Ra, or with Hathor, with women. But there was considerable overlap among the gods. A single god could have many names that defined their role as a god. Many gods were seen in the roles of triad. So, for example, we would say today, for those of you who are Christian, Jesus, Lamb of God. Jesus, Prince of Peace. Jesus, Savior of mankind. These are all names that describe the same person, but their role at that moment is different. Ra, the sun god, in fact, had many different names. Khepri, the morning rising sun. Khepri was the dung beetle that pulled the sun over the sky. Raharakti, which is the sun that sails across the sky during the day. And then Atum, the evening setting sun. The pharaohs were seen as gods on earth. They were descendants of Amon, regarded as the first Egyptian king, who in turn was descended from the sun god Ra and the falcon god of kingship, Horus. Egyptians believed that they were given the authority to rule when the world was created. What we're going to see tonight, for those of you who have studied the Hebrew scriptures in the Bible, you will see many comparisons. You will see many elements here where the Hebrews have borrowed from these ancient stories of the Egyptians. For example, in the Hebrew book of Genesis, the same right of authority is granted to Adam when God sets him on the earth and gives him dominion over all things. Referred to as the Lord of all the sun, disk, and circles. What a great name that would be, wouldn't it? The Pharaoh was believed to be one with the universe and the gods. The Pharaoh was regarded as an intermediary between the gods and the people on earth. In the same respect, for those of you who are Catholic, the Pope is considered to be the vicar of Christ on earth, the living embodiment and representation of Jesus Christ here on earth. And therein comes the power. When we look at global theocracies, the Catholic Church is actually considered a theocracy. The power is given from God to the Pope, who then gives this power out to those among the church. And even the Vatican City is considered a theocratic state because almost everyone living inside is a member of the clergy. Through them, the life force was given from the gods to the people. Ancient Egypt operated as a theocracy, with the people ruled by a king who was appointed by the gods. In some periods, the pharaohs were actually seen as incarnations of the gods. In fact, at a coronation of the pharaoh, this wasn't a moment when the pharaoh is now a god, becomes a god. This is the moment when they drop the cloth and reveal the God who is always there. There's a deep connection between gods and the animals that you will see throughout all of the Egyptian hieroglyphs and the myths. Gods having animal manifestations were shown with the human body and the head of their animal. So gods often were shown with the human body and the head of their animal. The pharaohs were shown with a human head and the body of an animal. You'll see this in the interplay. Pay attention when you're in Cairo and at the various sites. You will see the differentiations, and you'll automatically be able to tell which one was a pharaoh and which one was a god. Some of the gods were deified animals. Characteristics of gods often matched the characteristics of the animals they were associated with. Male gods were often the falcon, bull, and ram. Goddesses were the cobra, cow, vulture, and lioness. Animals could express aspects of a deity's nature. For example, some goddesses were lionesses in their fiercer aspects, but were cats when they were at play. Serpents, Apolpus, the god of chaos, was the foe of Ra, the sun god. Hippopotamus was Taweret, the protector of women and families. The lion, Sekhmet, the goddess of war. And the cat, the goddess of pleasure, home and domesticity, and women's secrets. So, lady, you had a goddess, Bastet, who would keep your secrets for you. Animals in temples. Animals were often found roaming the temples. You'll see this also in India. You'll see some types of animals roaming the streets, particularly in parts of rural India. You'll see the cows will be roaming in the streets very freely. Here, live animals in ancient Egypt were kept in the temples, and in some temples, there are found millions and millions of mummified animals. In one temple in Saqqara, they actually found 60,000 mummified ibises. Animals were an important part of religious life of ancient Egypt. The idea was that divine creatures were born at the dawn of Egyptian civilization in a time when there was much heavier rainfall. So they came to see many of these animals as central to their myths. And they began to connect them specifically with gods. One of these gods was the crocodile, and the crocodile laid its eggs upon the riverbanks before the Nile floods came. And so they came to understand that the goddess who was a crocodile was magical because it automatically, when it laid its eggs, it was able to foretell that the flood season was about to happen. And that in and of itself is miraculous, isn't it? The creation myth is a wonderful story, and you will see some similarities in the creation myths, I hope. The creation myth describes how the earth was created out of chaos by the god Atum, a primeval son, god, and creator. Atum, is the substance from which all creation unfurled. He is the Lord of the universe. In his human form, he represents the king of Egypt. Now compare this to Adam, which derives from the Greek word atomos, which means uncuttable and indivisible. Aren't these amazing connections? We know the atom is the building block of all matter, the substance from which all things have their being, in the same way the ancient Egyptians understood that of their primeval creator god, Atum. In the ancient Egyptian view, the earth was seen as a sacred landscape, a reflection of the sky world where the gods resided. So here again we see this mirror reflection that there was a God's world in the sky, and that earth was a reflection of that sky world. When the gods left the earth to reside in the sky world, the pharaohs inherited their right to rule. The first gods. The Book of the Dead describes how the world was created by Atum. And I'll go back to showing you the date of this. 1640 to 1550 BCE. In the beginning, for those of you who are picturing the book of Genesis right now, close your eyes and listen. In the beginning, the world appeared as an infinite expanse of dark and directionless waters named None. How many things were there? None. Atum created himself out of none by an effort of will or by uttering his own name. So when we think about this question of how was God created, philosophy goes back, theologians discuss this as God as the uncaused cause. How many of you have heard God as the uncaused cause? This answers that question beautifully and poetically, that Atum created himself out of none, out of nothingness, by an effort of will or by uttering his own name. And we hear this in the Hebrew scriptures as well. I am who am, which is the name Yahweh. By the sheer utterance, his name came into being. As the creator of the gods and humans, he was responsible for bringing order to the heavens and the earth. So again, there was chaos, and then because of his presence, he brings order to the heavens and the earth. So the question comes, which came first? The Bible stories of creation or the Egyptian stories of creation? The first 5 books of the Hebrew scriptures, known as the Pentateuch, were written in the 5th century BCE. Until the late 19th century, the consensus view of the biblical scholars was that Moses wrote the first books of the Bible. They were called the Mosaic books. Church Father Jerome, however, suggested that Ezra the priest wrote the Pentateuch based on notes made by Moses because the timing wouldn't be appropriate at that time. So it shows that the Egyptian creation story predates the Hebrew creation story by approximately 1,000 years. According to the pyramid text written on the walls of the pyramids, the creator God emerged from the chaotic darkness of Nun as a mythical Bennu bird. And now we're going to see a connection between the Egyptians and the ancient Greeks. This bird, the Bennu bird, flew to Heliopolis, the ancient city now located near Cairo, where at dawn he was consumed in a fire and miraculously sprang back to life. The capstone placed at the top of an obelisk or a pyramid is called the Bennu stone. It's associated with the Bennu. Called the Pyramidion or the Bennu, it's a symbol of rebirth and immortality. This concept was later adopted by the Greeks as the story of the phoenix. Today, in the United States, we also know a little bit about Phoenix. The phoenix is a symbol of rebirth and immortality. The city of Phoenix, however, is known mostly for retirement communities. And the only bird that you'll find in Phoenix is really the early bird buffets. Boom. The children of the Creator God, the first Egyptian family tree. So now we're going to see this family tree starting here, where we start to see the beginning, the Creator, right? Now, how do we begin to explain where everything else came from? Well, similar to the stories that we see in other creation stories, you're going to see this family tree emerge now. So the son was Shu. He represented dry air, and the daughter Tefnut represented moisture. The twins symbolize two universal principles of human existence, life and justice. So we're not just seeing male and female, we're seeing life and justice, that if one is alive, there must be justice. Shu and Tefnut separated the sky from the waters, and they produced two twin children. The first one was a son, Geb. He represented dry land, and the second was the daughter, Nut, and she was the sky goddess. So now you see this amazing visual here, which you will be able to see represented in some of the tomb drawings. It was believed that Geb and Nut were born gripped tightly in each other's arms and had to be separated by their father, Shu. The same graphic, by the way, you will find throughout the Pacific Island groups. This is how the people, the Maori of New Zealand and many other Polynesian groups, explain the creation of earth and sky, is much in the same way. To the ancient Egyptians, this explained why earth and sky were separated from one another by the air we breathe. When the waters receded, a mound of earth, Geb, appeared, providing the first solid dry land for the sun god Ra to rest, because they had to explain where the sun rested at night when it sat. Geb and Nut produced four offspring. Sons were Seth, the god of disorder, and Osiris, the god of order. And here again we see setting up the first two sons. And what are these two sons going to do to each other? I'll reveal that in a minute. Nephthys, the goddess of the air, and Isis, the goddess of healing and magic. This completed the Heliopolitan Ennead, the group of 9 deities that began with Atum, the primeval creator god. Osiris married his sister, Isis, and the two ruled over Egypt, creating peace and prosperity. And here, folks, we see the first transatlantic flight with the gods flying coach. They were just like us, really. The first rebellion, when Ra, the sun god, became old, the deities tried to take advantage of his senility. So here we now see the fall from grace. Think about this for those of you who are Christian, who believe in the idea that there was a war and that Lucifer was at battle with Michael the archangel, and that the idea of humans also fighting at this time. Even humans plotted against him, which led to their fall from divine grace. And so begins the notion of original sin. The idea that human beings fell from grace, but they were led by these other deities who tried to pull away from Ra. In reaction to the rebellion, Ra sent his eye to slaughter the rebels. Only his eye is all he needed, the eye of Ra. And so when we hear this today, you hear of the eye of Ra, you know that it means something bad is coming. After punishing his foes, he changed himself into the contented goddess Hathor, depicted as a cow. In pain and weary of the problems, Ra withdrew from the world. And so what he did was he mounted on Nut, the sky daughter, who raised him into the heavens, and the other gods clung to Hathor's belly and became the stars. So when you look to the sky, you can thank the goddess Nut for raising the sun god Ra high into the sky and raising the other gods along with him as stars. Following this, Thoth, the moon god, was given a spell to protect humans from harm when Ra was hidden from them. So here again, people were afraid of what would happen at nighttime. So in their brilliance, they created a story about Thoth, the moon god, and that he was given a spell that protected them at night while the sun god was away and couldn't be found. From that moment on, when Ra ascended into the heavens, humans were separated from the gods as earth was now separated from the heavens. Ra's journey across the sun is a wonderful thing for all of humans to watch. Ra lived in the heavens where order was established. Each morning, he was reborn in the east and traveled across the sky in a boat, accompanied by a number of gods who acted as his crew. The sun god was carried across the sky by the scarab god Khepri, the dung beetle. The sun god was the most important deity in the Egyptian pantheons. He had many names. He was Aten, the sun disk. He was Khepri, the scarab, the rising sun. He was the sun's zenith. He was Ra, the god of Heliopolis. And as the setting sun, he was Atum, the creator of the universe. The sun, symbol of light and enlightenment, is probably the most enduring symbol that we can find from ancient and modern religions. Living in a land of eternal sunshine, it is no wonder that the idea of the sun became that of a god. Now we'll talk briefly, not so briefly, about the great gods of Egypt. Egypt had one of the largest and most complex pantheons of gods in any civilization in the ancient world. Over the course of history, literally thousands of gods and goddesses were worshipped. The characteristics of any of these gods could be far-reaching or very, very specific. Some gods were creator gods, some gods were sun gods, and some gods were responsible for the morning sun. Some gods were responsible for the morning dew. Some gods were responsible for women's secrets. These were all very, very different depending on the needs. And again, what we will see here is the difference between people, place, and time. What you will notice across all of mythology and all of religions is that these things are differentiated by people, place, and time. You change the people, you change the place, and you change the time, or any one of these, and what you've done is you've changed the entire concept of the god, its powers, and its meaning to the people. But these gods could change over time, and they rose and fell in importance as their cultures and societies did the same. Osiris was the god of the underworld. He also symbolized death, resurrection, and the cycle of the Nile floods that Egypt relied on for agricultural fertility. So here now we see Osiris symbolizing death and resurrection. Do we know of any other god today that also symbolizes death and resurrection? You will see this same pattern of death and resurrection repeating itself throughout the gods of history. And why was Osiris the god of death and resurrection? Because remember, his brother Seth killed him. And this goes back to the biblical story, creation story, the Hebrew creation story of Cain and Abel. The two brothers who were the first in line, they were the first progeny, and they got into a fight because of kingship, and one killed the other. In the same way, Osiris was a king of Egypt who was murdered and dismembered by his brother Seth. But how did he become the god of resurrection as well? We see now his wife Isis comes to the scene. Now Isis had almost no form in early Egyptian mythology, in early Egyptian lore. But here we see her fulfilling her role, putting him back together. And women, don't you do just that. When your men fall apart, you put them back together again. And here, represented throughout history, is your form, the goddess Isis, who puts her man back together again, and allowing themselves now to conceive a son, the god Horus. So, over time, Isis is mentioned. It was very little in the beginning, but she grew in honor and in fame over the course of Egyptian history to become one of the most lasting goddesses in the Egyptian pantheon. As the devoted wife who resurrected Osiris after his murder and raised their son Horus, Isis also embodied the traditional virtues of motherhood and of being a good wife. As the wife of the underworld as well, so she wasn't just the wife of this god, she was the wife of the underworld. Isis was one of the main deities concerned with rites for the dead. And she was one of the last remaining Egyptian goddesses to still be worshipped after the kingdom of Egypt was long gone. In fact, in the Greco-Roman period, she was identified with the Greek goddess Aphrodite, and her cult spread as far west as Great Britain and as far east as Afghanistan. And it's believed that depictions of Isis with the infant Horus influenced Christian imagery of Mary with Jesus. Horus, the name Horus, is actually the Latinized version of the Egyptian Hor, which means the distant one. He was in the sky, flying way over it. And don't we think of gods in many respects as just that? We think of our gods as in the sky, looking down on us, seeing us, and that he's up there paying attention. We can't really see him, but we know he's there looking down on us. Depicted as a falcon or a man with a falcon's head, Horus was associated with war and hunting. Again, now we see the similar connection to Yahweh, the God of war in the Hebrew Bible. Egyptair even still uses this today. How many of you have seen the movie Stargate many years ago with James Spader? If you remember the warriors in there, with the warriors who protect the pharaoh, they also had the same look. It was all mechanized, but it's this same idea of Horus in the showing the protection from the skies. His symbols are the eye of Horus, one of the most famous Egyptian symbols, and the falcon. Seth was the god of chaos, violence, deserts, and storms. In the Osiris myth, he is the murderer of Osiris. In some versions of the myths, he actually tricks Osiris into laying down into a coffin and then seals it shut. What an awful way. Seth is often depicted as an animal or as a human with the head of an animal. He usually has a long snout and long ears. He has a dog-like body with a tuft-like tail at the end. Many scholars believe now that there was no such animal, that he was really a composite of many types of animals, and that he was really a mythical composite, which he's the only one. Ptah, pronounced Ptah, was, I don't even know why, I'm going to have to change that, right, because I automatically pronounced it, was head of the triad of gods worshipped at Memphis. The other two members of the triad were Ptah's wife and Sekhmet, the goddess of war. Ptah, the husband of the goddess Sekhmet, was a creator god. So again, now we see part of this triad, because we've also talked about Amon as also a creator god. And he thought and brought all things into existence just by thinking it. As the god who created all of the other deities, Ptah was worshipped as the inventor of masonry and of craftspeople and of architects. In fact, for many of you have heard of the great architect of the pyramids, Imhotep. He claimed to be the son of Ptah. And so this is common. You'll see the pharaohs claim to be the son of God. And you'll actually see this. God is Ra, right? Moses in Egyptian means son of. So when you hear Ramesses, this is actually a shortening for Ra Moses, son of Ra. Now in Hebrew, Moses means he who is drawn from the water. And so this is a very interesting play on words for Moses, the liberator of the Hebrew Scriptures. Ptah's divine breath, very similar to that of Athena in Greek mythology, was believed to contain the building blocks of creation that were said to have given life to everything in the beginning. The coronation ceremonies were often held in Memphis, the capital of ancient Egypt. With his companions Sekhmet and Nefertem, he was one of the Memphis triad of deities. And this remained so right up until the new Memphis Trinity of Elvis Presley, Johnny Cash, and Jerry Lee Lewis. Ra, one of the several deities associated with the sun, was usually represented with a human body and the head of a falcon. It was believed that he sailed across the sky in a boat each day and made a passage through the underworld each night, during which he would have to defeat the sun god, the snake god Apopus, in order to rise again. So take a look here. Now you see the snake wrapped around the sun god. Every night, your God, and all day, your God was fighting for you, fighting to free the sun from Apopus, the god of deception, the snake of deception. Now, this concept goes back almost a full 1,000 years before the story of creation in the Hebrew Scriptures. So again, we see this idea of the serpent as being beneath us, as something that is deceptive. And this comes to us from this period of time, perhaps, when the Egyptians held the Israelites. And imagine that over that period of hundreds of years, the people of Israel would have come to know these stories and would have come to have believed and accepted some of these stories as their own. Ra's cult was centered in Heliopolis, now a suburb of Cairo. Over time, Ra came to be syncretized with other sun deities, especially Amon. Hathor, depicted as a cow, or a woman with the head of a cow, is another goddess. She embodied motherhood and fertility and protected women during childbirth. She also had an important funerary element known as the Lady of the West. In fact, today, the tombs are built on the west bank of the Nile. Last year, we had a wonderful opportunity with our children to do a morning hot air balloon ride starting at 6 o'clock in the morning over the Valley of the Kings. And what a remarkable experience to be raised up above all of these tombs looking down. But all of the tombs are on the west bank of the Nile to be received by her. And believers hope to be welcomed personally by Hathor in the afterlife. Anubis was concerned with funerary practices and with care for the dead. He was represented as a jackal or a man with the head of the jackal. And why would that be? Generally because they would have seen jackals going around the bodies of the people who had just been buried. Jackals would have been scavenging for food. In the Old Kingdom, before Osiris rose to prominence as the lord of the underworld, Anubis was considered the principal god of the dead. According to myth, Anubis embalmed and wrapped the body of the murdered king Osiris, who was murdered by his brother Seth, becoming the patron god for embalmers. So here again we see a very, very specific role, that of a patron god for embalmers. Thoth, the god of writing and wisdom, was depicted as a baboon or a sacred ibis, or as a man with the head of an ibis. He was believed to have invented language itself in hieroglyphic script and to serve as a scribe and advisor for the gods. He was also said to have had magic and secrets unavailable to the other gods. So, as one who was writing and one who created language, he was the one who was able to share the secrets of the universe with all of the other gods. So he was very, very important. After a person died, you've probably seen this represented or heard this story, the heart of the person who had died was weighed against the feather of Ma'at, and the feather was considered the goddess of truth and justice. The god was. The scales were watched by Anubis, the jackal-headed god of embalming, and the results recorded by Thoth, the god of writing. So if your heart was heavier than the feather of Ma'at, it was filled with untruths and lies, and it was weighed down because you lived an unworthy life. Your heart must be light. It must be as light as air as you carry it and as you walk and as you live. And in so being, you will be judged accordingly as lighthearted. The verdict was then reported to Osiris, the god of the dead. Bastet, in her earlier forms, was represented as a woman with the head of a lion or that of a cat. She took a less ferocious form in time, and she actually became represented as a goddess of pleasure, the goddess of enjoyment and domesticity. Amon was the god of the air and probably had a name meaning the hidden one. He was represented as a man wearing a crown with 2 feathers. After the rulers of Thebes rebelled, he was actually given credit for taking over the Hyksos. In a form merged with the sun god Ra, he became Amon-Ra. You've probably heard this from the many movies that are about this period of time, probably the mummy movies. Amun-Ra, the most powerful deity in Egypt, a position he retained for most of the New Kingdom. Now we'll talk briefly about the Trinity, and this is perhaps one of the more interesting pieces when we consider this vis-a-vis other religious faiths. It's generally assumed that the Trinity is of Christian origin. However, the Trinity is a common element in many ancient faiths. Even the early Catholic theologian, St. Jerome, testified that all the ancient nations believed in the Trinity. 1600 BCE, the Sumerian creation story said, "The universe was divided into 3 regions, each of which became the domain of a god. Anu's share was the sky, the earth was given to Enlil, and Ea became the rulers of the waters. Together, they constituted the triad of the great gods." 1600 BCE. 2000 BCE, we see the Babylonian Trinity. The ancient Babylonians recognized the doctrine of a Trinity of 3 persons in one God. So here we see for the first time, really, in relatively close to the time of of the Hebrew story, the idea of a triune Godhead. But keep in mind, the idea of a triune Godhead was not a Hebrew notion. This is very much a Christian notion. And so we see here appearing from the composite God with three heads forming part of their mythology, and the use of the equilateral triangle, an emblem of the Trinity in unity. 2000 BCE, we see in India, the Puranas, one of the Hindu Bibles, more than 3,000 years ago, contains the following passage. O ye three lords, know that I recognize only one God. Inform me, therefore, which of you is the true divinity, that I may address to him alone my adorations. The three gods, Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, manifest to him, replied, Learn, O devotee, that there is no real distinction between us. What to you appears, such is only the semblance. The single being appears under three forms by the acts of creation, preservation, and destruction. But he is one. So the idea of the God is that there was a creator God, a God that preserved, and a God that destroys. And that this is one God with the triune Godhead. Greece, 400 BCE, in the 4th century BCE, Aristotle wrote, All things are three, and thrice is all. And let us use this number in the worship of the gods, for as the Pythagoreans say, everything and all things are bounded by threes. For the end, the middle, and the beginning have this number in everything, and these compose the number of the Trinity. And then in Egypt, the hymn to Amon, no God came into being before him, and that all gods are three, Amon, Ra, and Ptah. And there is no second to them. Hidden is his name as Amon. He is Ra in face, the sun, and his body is Ptah. This is a statement of the Trinity, the three chief gods of Egypt, subsumed into one of them, Amon. Theologically, this statement is remarkably and strikingly similar to the later Christian form of monotheism, Trinitarian monotheism. And this concept had a profound impact on later Christian thought. The last topic of discussion tonight is the idea of demons, that we can't talk about the Egyptian gods without also talking about demons. The Egyptian pantheon of gods is filled with mighty human-animal hybrids, Horus, Anubis, Sekhmet. But the ancient Egyptians also acknowledged another group known as demons. These were supernatural beings that took on varying forms and were thought to live at the threshold of the divine and human world. So now we see gods, humans, and in between them were the demons. They moved between these worlds when called upon by gods or humans. And to the early Egyptians, the ancient Egyptians, these demons were probably more important than the gods themselves. Modern perceptions of demons, we think about a demon as very evil or harmful forces. And they were in the same way harmful forces, but they could also be quite benevolent. They were a much more approachable form. We might consider them today, for those of you who are Catholic, or for those of you who believe in sainthood, the idea might be similar to what a saint would be, that you would call upon, instead of calling the great gods, you would call upon someone who was closer to you, someone who was a little bit more like you and understood your needs. Images of demons first began to appear between 2030 and 1640 BCE. Before this time, the worship of gods was highly centralized, but at later times, Egyptians realized that they could also participate in religious life. Because remember, early on, only the gods allowed the pharaohs to participate. Only they were allowed to go on to the next world. And the pharaohs realized, we can't get people to work very well for us if we're the only ones who get to enjoy the afterlife. So, in order to build the great pyramids and the great monuments, they had to convince them that they would also have a share of this wonder and joy and enjoyment in the next life. And so they made this next life accessible to them. And they made prayer accessible to them. They made them a part of their services so that they can enjoin upon them to be a part of the great creation of the wonderful masterpieces that you will see over the next couple of days in Egypt. But the journey to the realm of the dead when you died was an arduous one, overseen by animal-human hybrid demons. So you were able to get to the next life, but you didn't know how to get there. So you had to pray to the demons. And the demons were in charge of the gates, and they had the curses and the spells to help you get through, the magic formulas to serve as passwords to help you pass through the gates. And demons would judge the spells as successful or not. So when you hear the idea of gatekeeper, this is where this idea originates. Egyptians believed epidemics were caused by demons. Even the winds took on demonic aspects for the Egyptians. And because demons were linked with the winds and with the spread of incurable diseases, individuals suffering from these epidemics turned to praying for demons for relief. Letters to the dead were written to people as well. Demons were also considered the ghosts of immediate family members. So we would write letters to the dead to help them help us from the next world. They were asked for blessings. They were asked to help them with many things in their lives. And these were called letters to the dead. Some of the letters to the dead were written to women after the husband remarried. These letters were written to appease their anger. So the husband is still alive. The wife has passed. And the husband takes it upon himself to write her a letter because he does not want her to be angry from the grave. And these letters were a ritual intended to heal the relationship between the living and an angry spirit. Despite having remarried, these letters may have sought to restore the woman who had passed away to a role in the new household, to guide those families to the next life. So ladies, for more than 4,000 years, little has changed. Even after you're long gone, the men in your lives will still expect you to clean up after them. And that is the end of my lecture, good people. I hope you have a wonderful couple of days in Egypt. Thank you very much.
Thank you.